So again, thank you all for joining today. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Computer Forensics for Prosecutors, Part 2. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. My name is William Moore, and I am with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. And as your technical host, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. The webinar will be posted on Intact's YouTube page where you can view other the webinar will actually be recorded and provided at a later time, and you can get the recording from our colleagues at APA. Please note for those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the chat area. Here you will find an FAQ for webinar participants that will likely address any technical related questions. Just simply click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you're viewing alone, there's no need to type anything at this time. Following today's presentation, we will have an online evaluation. After today's presentation, please take a few minutes to provide us feedback through the online evaluation. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Amy Peterson, for today's webinar.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Peterson. I'm a project associate with the Child Abuse Prosecution Project here at the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. APA is a private nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., serving prosecutors as well as their law enforcement and community partners. Thank you for joining our Child Abuse Prosecution webinar today. Today's webinar, Computer Forensics for Prosecutors Part 2, will be presented by Dean Chatfield of Search. This presentation is made possible by Grant 2019 CIFXK001, awarded by the Office of Justice Programs through Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. APA is very appreciative of their financial assistance and commitment to improving the justice system. Points of view or opinions in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily represent the views of the United States Department of Justice and the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. Today's presenter, Dean Chatfield, is a high-tech crime training specialist in the High-Tech Crime Training Services Department of Search, the National Consortium for Justice Information and Statistics. Prior to joining Search, Mr. Chatfield worked for the National White Collar Crime Center for 14 years as a computer crime specialist. He presented basic and advanced cyber investigative and computer forensic courses to local, state, federal, military, and international law enforcement agencies. He researched computer forensic issues and provided advice to law enforcement agencies in computer seizure and analysis. Mr. Chatfield has 25 years experience in law enforcement. He was a criminal investigator for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, where he conducted major felony investigations, including criminal enterprises, financial crimes, political corruption, and analysis of computers and computer-generated data. In his current position at Search, he provides training on digital evidence investigations and forensics to local, state, and federal justice agencies. He also conducts research on new tools and techniques involving digital evidence, provides technical assistance to justice agencies in active cases, prepares training curricula and other resource materials, teaches search investigative courses, and speaks at conferences throughout the United States. I will now turn it over to our presenter, Dean Chatfield.
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending. Let's get started on this. We got quite a few slides to go through. This is part two. Part one covered just the basic information about hardware, software, operating system versus file systems, partitioning, that type of thing. Part two is going to talk about specific computer forensic artifacts. So when you think about artifacts, you're talking about the evidence you're going to find on whatever digital media it may be. It may be a hard drive, it may be a thumb drive, it may be a compact flash card or a micro SD card, or it may be actual information, data from a cloud storage device. Bottom line, though, is every analysis is going to be unique. It's going to be unique both to the device and the data source, as well as the facts of the investigation. Obviously, a homicide investigation is going to have a different set of facts and things you want to prove versus a child exploitation case. So important facts of one investigation may not match up to another. Artifact relationships are often very different in each investigation. Let's start with the very basic one. First and always, date and time verification. Your examiner has to establish what the date and time is set on the machine, because all the data and all date and timestamps relevant to the data you're going to find in that machine are going to be based on the machine date and time. So at the time of seizure, your investigator or your analyst has to document the date and time of the system to make sure what time zone it's set for, how accurate is the time. Is it a day off? Is it a couple hours off? That can become very crucial down the line. Even though at the beginning of the investigation, you're not worried about date and time offsets. But if you don't gather at the beginning, you'll never have it later on in the investigation. So artifacts, date and timestamps, found in all sorts of data and systems. You're going to find it on the file system metadata, on file metadata, and within databases. Timestamps can be strung together to form timelines. As an example, a user logs into a system, browses to a folder, and sends a file to a recycle bin. All of those actions create timestamps, and those can be located during the analysis process. So depending on the file system, the application handling the file, timestamps can indicate movement of a file between volumes. In this example, we have a file was copied from an NTFS internal drive to an NTFS external drive. What's that mean? It means you had a file on a hard drive and it was simply copied to, say, a thumb drive. Created and access date and time is updated. Modified date and time stays the same. The earlier modified date and time is an indication that the file was once likely resided on different volumes, different media, in other words. So back in part one, we covered what some of the file systems are. NTFS is New Technology File System. It's a standard file system you'll find on all Windows-based machines. So if Windows created it, it's probably going to have an NTFS file system. It's a little more robust, a little faster, can handle larger files. And depending on the external media, it may support NTFS as well, depending on the size of the volume. That's just a little technical side note there for you. So other artifacts, the directory structure, the way the files are stored on the system. It used to be that prior to Windows, you had to create a folder someplace off of the root and put your files in there. So it's pretty specific and intent-wise as far as where the files were located at. Windows comes along and establishes My Documents and has a structure for users. Each user go ahead and put their files in. So if you have multiple people logging into the computer system, each user is going to have their own My Documents to keep them separate from the other users on the system. However, in the illustration here, you see that there was some handiwork done by an experienced user that created a bunch of new folders that were empty probably, and then he put the two folders that contained the data he wanted to hide down below. It makes it a little more difficult to find to the casual user that may be looking at his system. The directory structure itself can tell a lot about the sophistication of the users. File organization, another indicator is user domain control, where folders and folder count are often revealed by examining the directory structure. What's that saying is how this guy took the basic, my documents, or my downloads, my music, my videos, and then added folders underneath that to create his unique structure. That is not common. Windows is not going to do that for you. The user has to have control over that system to do that. File names are another artifact. File names often announce the content. Just a file, now that you have long file names, or you've had it since 1995 actually, you can be a little more descriptive in what the file is. It used to be you had 8 characters, and as you had to come up with some type of abbreviation to help you identify the file. Now it's long file names. You can be a lot more descriptive of the file names. However, you can also, there's 2 methods of hiding the true identity of the file. Windows works off of extensions. Up here we have JPEG files and Word documents, docx. Based on that extension, Windows assumes that's a graphic file that has a JPEG, or the docx means that's probably a Word document. That's why it has little icons out in front of it. The user can change those extensions. He could change the happy puppy from a JPEG to a TXT file. Windows would think it's a text file. And that's how it would appear in the directory structure. You wouldn't know that it wasn't a text file until you tried to open it and examine it. Another method is to simply hide the file. That's where it's talk about file attributes. You can go into each individual file, look at the properties, go to Advanced, and hide that file. So a normal view of the directory structure from Windows, that file would not be displayed. You would have to change settings within Windows to allow all hidden files and system files to be viewed. Another way of hiding information, but also it's a good indicator that this individual attempted to disguise or hide the data that he didn't want anybody else to see. Device users. Again, a lot of this information will be found in the registry. It may be found in a file on the drive itself, but the registered owner, the user accounts we talked about, email accounts, synced iDevices, meaning every time you connect that iPhone or you do a backup through iTunes or some other third-party application, you may find a folder within that program that has the backup of that device. Known wireless networks. This information, every time you connect to a wireless network, that information gets saved as a profile. And that profile data is saved within the registry on the system. Now, the password to log into that that Wi-Fi, that SSID, is encrypted within the registry by the user's account password. But there are tools that can easily retrieve that information and show you all of the Wi-Fi accounts that the user has connected to. Last time I looked at my system, I had probably 35 different Wi-Fi accounts, some of them going back several years from different conferences and classes that I had taught at and connected to Wi-Fi devices. History of USB devices. USB devices are the portable floppy disk of today. They hold a lot more data. I mean, you can find USB drives. You'd be hard-pressed to find a 1 gig USB drive nowadays. Now most of them are 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, even higher capacity, gigabyte capacity of USB drives, just thumb drives. Then you get into portable hard drives, which go up into terabyte sizes. and their pocket size. Connect with one cable, the computer supplies power to it, and it's a portable device. You can copy data over to it, unplug it, and walk away with it. But every time a USB device is connected to the computer, Windows logs that information in the registry. It can be retrieved. Here's an example of what an artifact information looks like for the history of a USB device. You notice that it says last connected, first connected, and the install date. The install date is actually the first time that device was hooked into the machine, because there's software on that USB device that the Windows has to download, make sure it has drivers so it can talk to that physical device, and it logs that as the first install or install date and time. Any dates after that will be subsequent attachments. So on the 14th, the individual may have plugged the USB drive in that did something on it. You could find activity other places in the machine. Disconnected, then came back the next day and plugged it back in. Hence, we have a different last connect date and time. But all this information is tracked within the registry and can be retrieved during analysis. Volume shadow copies. This is a unique feature that Windows enabled, that if you have this feature turned on, it will make a backup of the system into a file or group of files on the drive. You can also have it set to go ahead and back up the volume shadow copy to an external media. So you could have a USB drive plugged in and back up through your volume shadow copies to there. But basically what it is, it's a snapshot of the system. Now, you can create these, or, I hit myself there, or when you install an application, a lot of times an application, before it installs, it'll go ahead and tell the system to do a volume shadow copy, like a restore point is what we're talking about, which means the system will back up everything up to that point in time, then allow the application to go ahead and do its install. So if there's any problems, you can always step back to that last restore point and bring the system back up to just before that application was installed. So it can be done by the individual requesting it, it can be done on a timeline by Windows, or it can be done by a third-party application during an install procedure. Browser history. Browser history is revealed more than just websites someone visited. Obviously, if they go out to a website, that's going to be in there. But you can also find information about email accounts they're connecting to. You may not find the data, the actual emails, but you may find representation that they went to Gmail and accessed an email account, or they went to some other location and accessed an email account. Web-based services such as cloud storage. For example, I use Dropbox, so every time I go to Dropbox, I'm going out through my browser, which is documenting that fact. Again, membership affiliation services, anything that the user is accessing through the web, there'll be a reference to that in the browser history. So here's an example of some browser history. You notice it covers 2 different dates, but you can quickly look and see that it went to Google Maps. We're looking at time calculator, activity log. This is obviously a Google Sheet, so it's an online spreadsheet where the individual's keeping track of some type of activity log. He's got a Gmail inbox here, and then also Digital Forensic Laboratory and IASIS Membership Center. So these are activities that you find listed in the browser history. Superfetch and prefetch. When Microsoft claims that Windows is the fastest operating system out there, they do this through a lot of little behind-the-scenes techniques. Prefetch, superfetch is basically one of those. As you use the computer, Windows recognizes the applications you use on a frequent basis. Like when I start my computer up in the morning, we use Slack for internal communication, so I log into Slack. I log into my Outlook for my email. I open a browser window so I can access some of the resources. I open Excel because I keep track of certain data in a spreadsheet all day long. Windows recognizes that, and it creates a prefetch or superfetch cache for those programs. So as Windows creates these prefetch, what it is, it preloads those programs into memory, a part of the programs into memory, so that when I click on the Excel to open that spreadsheet, part of the Excel program is already set up and running in memory. So that allows Windows to go ahead and load the application faster. In an investigation, that prefetch, superfetch cache can give you indications of some type of criminal activity. For example, here on the screen, we're talking about a peer-to-peer client. And the fact that there is, in the Windows prefetch, there's a notation of Shiraz's peer-to-peer client, the path, how many times it's been run, and the last date and time it was ran. All this from the prefetch. Here's another example. The individual uses Chrome quite a bit, the last run date, and it shows how many times it's been run. So it's not just a casual user. This is an everyday user of Chrome. He uses it quite a bit. Carved file to data files. Just because the file is deleted doesn't mean it's gone, and that's a very true statement. Unless there's some type of security software running in the background, and when you delete a file, it does a secure delete, meaning it overwrites the data area, that data is still out there. When you delete a file, the only thing that changes is the directory structure that points to where that file was located at, the data. So depending on the file system, it's just a minor change. One character changes in that directory structure to tell the operating system, hey, this is a deleted file, don't worry about it anymore. So your forensic utilities can quickly go out and scan the unallocated space. Unallocated meaning it's not tied to an active file. So if you had an active JPEG file, a graphic file out there, and then you deleted it, the data for that graphic file is still out on the drive in the data area, but the directory structure for it says it's been deleted. And so the allocation units, the track of allocation units where the file was stored, are zeroed out. So there's no path back to the data. But your forensic software can go out and do data carving and identify the JPEG file and retrieve it. It may not be able to tie it back to an actual file name or a date and time information, but at least you'll get the graphic back. For example, JPEG files, most common graphic file out there. These files have a header built into them, meaning the very first few bytes in the data area of the file contain a unique signature of hexadecimal characters, binary code. Your forensic application can know that and can search for that header. Once it finds the header, it can then read down through and start looking for other unallocated units that might contain the footer, because in a JPEG file, there is also a 2-byte, a 2-byte footer that indicates this is the end of that JPEG file. So if it can find the header and the footer, it can recover the file. Not all files have headers and footers. Text files, for example, do not. Program files. This is just where Windows installs all the applications by default. Now, in this example, we're talking about program files on a 32-bit operating system. If you have a 64-bit operating system, it's going to look the same as a 32-bit operating system. If you go in to the program files, you're going to see two entries in there. You're going to see program files and then program files x86. Because if the application is a 32-bit application, needs to be handled, especially on a 64-bit operating system that's going to be stored in a different folder. But from here, you can quickly look down and look for applications that are installed, that were installed in the system that may not be there anymore, but their folder is still there. Just because you have an application installed and use it and then delete that or uninstall that application, not all of the data associated to that file, that program, does get deleted. So you may still find an indication, as this example here points, that we're dealing with a peer-to-peer client. Either is installed or was installed in the system. Jump lists. Jump lists are a feature that's enabled by the developers of an application. And what is a jump list? If you look down your taskbar on your computer screen, you should have several icons down, the applications you use on a frequent basis. If you point at one of those applications and right-click on it, a jump list will pop up and it'll show you the last applications that you've used. It's a way to quickly go back and access a file that you had worked on before. So like if you right-clicked on Word, you get a list of Word documents that have recently been opened on that system. So jump lists, again, are stored in the registry and they're displayed directly on the desktop. Shell files, link files, commonly known as shortcuts. You see these in the desktop all the time. They're highlighted with a little arrow on them. It's nothing but a shortcut that points to where the actual program file resides at. Now, depending on the application when it's installed, it may create a shortcut on the desktop. At the same time, depending on how that application is uninstalled or deleted, the shortcut may remain on the desktop, and they may find references to it elsewhere on the drive. These shell links or shortcuts contain valuable metadata, including MAC times and target file directory location of the target file. Thumbnails. This little quick view icon, so to speak, of graphics, of the contents of graphics. There's different processes to create thumbnails and caches of thumbnails. So operating system, web browsers, and WebKits will create their own thumbnails for display. Make it a little bit faster to locate files. The presence of thumbnails can indicate a user interaction with the files. If it's a Windows thumb cache, it's strongly indicated of user domain and control, meaning the user had to do something to create that thumbnail within Windows. However, if you find thumbnails that were created by your browser, you have to kind of take those with a grain of salt. You have to do more work to prove that that individual actually accessed that graphic file, as opposed to simply click on a web page and that web page downloaded a ton of graphics. Those would be found in the browser caches, but they may also show up in the thumbnail cache as well. So the Windows thumb cache is stored in a database, and that database is named and it's user specific. So if you have 3 users on the system, each user is going to have their own Windows thumb cache, because this is something the user had to do to access the file, which caused Windows to create a thumbnail of that graphic. Contents of the thumb cache are not automatically deleted when the target file is deleted. So in other words, the user went out and looked at the file and then deleted the file, but yet thumb cache is still there. It's still showing that that file at one time was viewed on that system, and it will also reveal where it was at on the system, including if it is on external media. So if they plugged in a USB drive and they looked at a graphic file over there, the thumb cache is still going to be created on the main computer system, which can be retrieved and accessed. You may not be able to access the actual file, which will have the thumbnail of the file to show user interaction. Virtual machines. Basically, these are complete operating systems running from a file within a computer. As it says, virtual machine is a computer file, typically called an image, that behaves just like an actual computer. Referred to as creating a computer within a computer. It runs in a window like other programs, giving the end user the same experience as the virtual machines they would have in a host operating system. Perfect example of this. I telecommute. I work from home. One of the tasks I have to do in assisting law enforcement is tracking down ownership and legal process information for applications and websites that are involved in their investigations. Obviously, some of those applications and websites are not things I want tied back to my home IP address. So I use a special machine. I have a virtual machine installed, created on that I start up so that nothing gets written back to my system. It disguises my network controllers. I then use a web browser that supports a virtual private network, a VPN. So on the other end, when I go to one of these nefarious websites, I'm being reported as coming from some other country, from an IP that does not belong back to my home. So I can go out and do the research I need to do, find the ownership information if it's out there, if they have it posted there, and retrieve it, save it, and give it to the law enforcement agency that made the request so they can go ahead and follow up on it. So virtual machines can be used to protect yourself. Bad guys can use them to disguise what they're doing. In addition, you can create a virtual machine that could hide a complete operating system or complete library of graphic files. Because when you look at the file system, all you're going to see is this large file that has an extension indicating that it's a virtual machine. You won't be able to look into it until you mount that virtual machine and go and explore it. How much is this stuff? Free. There's two listed right there. Oracle VirtualBox is free, and VMware Workstation Player is free. Very simple to set up. If you're interested in that, we've got PowerPoints that can walk you through building a VirtualBox VM very easily. Again, VM images can be easily moved between computers because the whole environment is saved as a file on the drive. So it's just a file. So I could copy it and put it on a pocket drive and move it to another computer. And if I had the VM software installed on there already, I just simply point that VM software at that pocket drive at the VM image, and boom, it loads up and it's running. And everything it does is protected and contained within that virtual environment. Nothing gets written to the drive other than when I'm done and shut down, it compresses the VM file back down to a smaller file. Therefore, I could take and have a complete graphics library in a virtual environment and move it and share it with other people by giving them a copy of the VM. A good use of virtual machines, other than like I use it to protect myself when I working tech assist, is you can actually take an image of the suspect's computer and then mount that image in the virtual software. So that you're actually going to boot this thing up, and you'll be sitting there as if you were running it off of the suspect's computer. So you will see exactly what the suspect saw on their computer. It gives you the ability to look at applications and the environment they were in. This screenshot is taken from a virtual environment of a suspect's computer, showing his peer-to-peer connectivity and what he was up to, the type of files that he was sharing and downloading and uploading. Network information. Again, most of it's stored in the registry. It can be accessed and retrieved during an analysis. Computers will store network information to permit future connections. Back when I was talking about every time you connect your computer to a Wi-Fi, it saves that profile. And that profile contains the date and times you connected. It contains the name of the Wi-Fi. So like if you're a Marriott hotel, it may say Marriott guest, something like that. But that's the SSID. That's the identifier for that wireless network. And if there's a password associated to it that you had to type in, that also gets stored in the registry. It's encrypted in the registry using the user's account. So that information can be retrieved. There are tools out there that can quickly pull those things back and give you a listing of all the Wi-Fi access points that user connected to, when they connected to them, and the passwords that were used. So if you're examining a suspect's computer and he has Wi-Fi access in his house, if he has multiple Wi-Fi set up, you may be able to glean a better idea of the way he structures passwords based on the Wi-Fi passwords he uses. If you're doing an examination on the router, you're going to need a password to get into the router. And so you might see something in his Wi-Fi passwords that gives you a clue as how he would have crafted the password to get into the router. So say it's a Wi-Fi was ABC and the password was ABC123. He's using the first few characters of the Wi-Fi to identify it, and then followed by a unique number sequence. Might use the same thing on the router. So that network information can be examined. You can see connectivity. You can see IP addresses that were associated to it, dates and times. That type of information is available, again, during the analysis process, depending on what you need from your case, your investigation. Antivirus logs. Nowadays, you have to look for these things. Look and document what type of antivirus software is installed on the machine. Is it just Windows, or do they have a third-party application installed? And look at the activity logs. Look for, make sure, was this program installed and never updated, or did the individual update on a frequent basis, or was updating automatically done? Look at the if it identified any malware during its scans, so that you can see the date it found some particular piece of malware and what it did to it. If it negated it, if it required user interaction, whatever, that'll be in those logs. And that can become important to you down the road in case the defense decides to say, my client didn't save all these 500 graphic files on the drive. It was done by some malware. It would help to defend that allegation. Event logs. When Windows first was created, it had a parallel development track. When I say that, Microsoft created a Windows version for networks, corporations to use. On that side, they were really worried about security, so everything they built into it was for security and tracking information. On the other side, they built the consumer side. That's where you had Windows 3.1, 3.11, Windows 95, Windows 98. When XP came out, Microsoft merged the business side and the home side. On the business side, you had event logs, meaning the operating system tracked everything that goes on the system. It creates logs, so it can show remote access, local logons, system time changes, shutdowns. All of that's contained within the Windows environment. And ever since XP, all your versions of Windows contain these event logs. And those can be reviewed and pulled up and analyzed to see what was going on in the system. How much of this was Windows-generated traffic versus traffic specific to the user? What did they do? You know, did they go in and change the date and time of the system so they could download some files and then went and changed the date and time back to the current date and time, trying to hide information or disguise when an event occurred, things like that. That all shows up in the logs. Prior to the merging the two under Windows 95 and before, you had no way of telling when the individual changed date and times. System RAM. Why is RAM so important? What is RAM? Well, we covered this a little bit in part one, but RAM is where everything happens on that computer. You have a hard drive that has memory built into it. That's permanent memory. When you shut the power off, the data stays there. It's still there. You can turn the power back on and retrieve the data. RAM is a series of chips on a computer that are strictly for the operation of the computer. But everything that happens when that computer is running goes through RAM. If you open a Word document and start typing, you type on the keyboard, those keystroke signals go to the processor. They get to the processor by going into a buffer in RAM. The processor pulls that data out of the buffer, interprets it, and then sends it off to the screen so it's displayed on the screen so you can see what you've been typing. If you want to save that file comes back down through the buffers. It goes through a buffer that the processor then sends it over to the hard drive or whatever media and writes it to the permanent media. You want to print it, it comes back through RAM and goes to the printer. So everything that happens in a system goes through RAM. Now, I've been doing computer forensics since 1985. And back when we started, we were concerned about some type of application that the bad guys could initiate that would damage the hard drive, the data on the hard drive. So we were concerned about preserving the largest amount of data which was on the drive. We weren't worried about RAM because RAM was very small in those days. Nowadays, RAM is much larger. You buy a computer system and by default it's usually going to be about 8 gigs of RAM or more, 16, 32, I think 192 is supported by some of the newer machines. So that's a lot of storage. A lot of data can be up there. And there are some things that happen on a computer that will only happen in RAM. So it's important that your examiner and your investigator, whoever sees the computer, if it's up and running, you have a utility available to capture the RAM, save it down as a file. If you don't capture it, once you unplug that computer and take it back to the office for analysis, that data is gone. RAM is volatile memory. You pull the plug, it's gone. You don't get it back. So preserve it initially. So some other files that happen when Windows is running, when the operating system is up and running. A hibernation file. If you sit there and leave the computer alone for a while, it'll detect the fact that you're not using it, so it's going to go into hibernation mode, meaning it'll step down how much power it uses and start shutting resources down. To do that, it takes the capture RAM and saves it onto the drive as in that hiberfil.sys file. So that's important to find and pull back up. You can get a copy of RAM that way. It won't be the most current copy, but it'll be a copy of RAM on that system at one point in time. It'll have date and timestamps associated to the file as well. Page file. When you're using a Windows system and you have one application open, maybe you have 5 applications open, and you open another application, Windows may take one of the running applications and temporarily capture that section of RAM and write it to the drive in the page file. So you can open up another application. That page file, again, is another snapshot of that portion of RAM. So during the seizure or during the analysis and examination, your examiner needs to look at the hibernation file and the page file to see if there's any data in there that may be recoverable. You can run the analysis tools on it just like you would on the hard drive and possibly recover graphic files. External media. external metadata. I do that every time I read that slide. File system metadata, information about files stored in the file system. So the file system is going to track certain information. It's going to have the modified access and change date and time. It's going to have the file name. It's going to have the location in the volume, meaning where was this file located at? What chunks of data area are associated that make up that file? And if you have the parent directory information, where is this file located in the directory structure itself? Metadata files, external files that describe another file. Often text files to databases configured by the developer to track all kinds of information. Internal metadata. For example, graphic files have EXIF data. So if you look at a graphic file, if you use a product, you can look at the graphic file and it will decode or come back and tell you, hey, there's EXIF data here. You can look at that database of information that's contained within the graphic file, and you may find what device was used to take that picture. It may be an iPhone, it might be a Canon camera, it may even have the serial number for the camera. And if you're lucky, it'll also have the GPS information for where that picture was taken at, that you can quickly pop that into Google Maps and boom, it'll show you the approximate location where that picture was taken at. Microsoft Office metadata. Little background. 1999, I was working on developing an advanced course in computer forensics for law enforcement. I had to put some files on a disk, and it kept telling me the files are too large, they wouldn't fit. So I went and edited the Word document, cut out a bunch of stuff, saved it, tried to put it back on there, it wouldn't go back on. It still said it's too large. When I looked at it, I realized the file was getting bigger instead of smaller when I was cutting data out of it. So I went and examined the file, and that's when I found metadata. I got a hold of somebody at Microsoft that I know, put me in touch with the Office people, production department, and they said, yeah, it's metadata. When you cut data out of a Word document, it writes it to drive and saves it as part of that file so that you can paste it back in someplace else later if you wanted to. But also contained in there is the last user information, the last time it was printed, the registered owner of the software. All of this is contained in there. Why? This is developed for network managers. So if they're looking at a file, who the heck created this file? How did it get here? This is the last person to access it. So I created a little 1-hour block of instruction. It just so happens I had 2 detectives from the Wichita, Kansas Police Department attend that class. Jump forward a few years to 2005. One of them called me and says, hey, did you hear we finally arrested the BTK killer in Wichita, Kansas? I said, yeah. The guy had been terrorizing Wichita, Kansas for 30 years, committed over 10 homicides. He was a serial killer. And they caught him by word metadata on a floppy disk that he had written his little taunting letter to the police on. They said once they got the floppy disk, they looked at the metadata, and within 10 minutes had surveillance set up on his house because the metadata showed the owner of the software was the church, and the last person to use the software, update the file, was Dennis. They went to the church directory and found that Dennis Rader was one of the elders in the church. He was the only Dennis listed in the church management. They went to his house, and they already knew that the individual that they were looking for had a black Jeep Wagoneer, and it was parked in his driveway. A few weeks later, through DNA, they were able to arrest him, and he admitted to the murders. So you can't overlook little things like that, things that make you go, huh. You need to look at them. Remember that Microsoft products do this, not just Office, all of the Office products, not just Word, but Excel, all of them will contain metadata that may tie something back to your suspect or the company. Databases. almost all of your applications nowadays use some type of database, especially your web-based applications. The databases can be different types, and they're configured by the developer, so they can determine the fields, what data is captured, what format it's captured in. So when it gets into your analysis of a database, it can get a little challenging because you have to first figure out how the developer created it, what these field names mean to the developer, and then is there evidentiary value in here? And then manually go through the database and parse it out, see what's in there. Installed applications, again, often indicative of sophistication and warrant forensic analysis. Application data often persists after the application is uninstalled. So you may still be able to find data even though the bad guy deleted or uninstalled the application. It may require additional analysis, kind of digging deep into the system. Date and time techniques, and that date and time analysis techniques can focus a search of evidence near when the event occurred. For example, Basic Tech out of Boston has a product called Autopsy. It's a free forensic application. One of the neat features of Autopsy, when you pull in a piece of evidence, an image of a drive, during its analysis process, it identifies everything that happened on that system by date and time for the last 7 days prior to that system being seized. So you can quickly go out and look and see what was going on in the system that week before you seized the computer. So if he was out there deleting files and stuff, that's going to be documented in that last 7 days. So that's the type of analysis you can do basically on date and time. You can see, identify causal and correlative relations between artifacts, identify artifacts, and maybe go unnoticed based on time. They can get lost in the soup of the whole drive. Here's an example. Based on date and time entries in different logs, router log shows that the HP laptop obtained a lease from the guest network. Prefetch shows on the laptop that BitTorrent was launched. You can read the screen just as well as I can, but bottom line, it shows right on down through the suspect connected through BitTorrent, downloaded some child graphics, and wrote them to the thumb drive. All of this documented through date and times in different logs. So, common indicators. Obviously, if you're working in an abuse case, you're looking for different types of information as opposed to a hacking or malware case. Same thing for a drug case. The presence or an absence of common indicators is often an evidentiary value. So if you're looking at a case and you expect to see certain things and instead it's all white, it's clean, that tells you something's going on. Also will give you an indication of how advanced your user is, what type of experience they have. Tips for success. First and foremost, include your digital evidence forensic examiner early in the investigation, often throughout the investigation. If you have access to the person that does your analysis, hook him up with the examiner, or to the investigator rather. Get them together, sit down, and one of the things I used to tell my prosecutors and investigators when they would bring something to me for analysis is I tell them, sit down and write up a wish list. Not what you think I will find, but what you pray I find. What would be the most fantastic thing you could ever hope to find on this drive? Write it down, because you never know what a good examiner can find on that drive. If you limit him to just look for these certain things, that's what he's going to look for. But if you give him a whole gamut of, it's a possibility we could find this. It'd be fantastic if we found this relationship here. Give him something to look for. I've got 5-6 minutes I've covered a lot of material. There's my contact information. I like to keep things simple. My email is dean@search.org. Don't be afraid to give me a call or shoot me an email. That's the easiest way. Shoot me an email. I will get back to you. If you want your investigator to reach out to me, have them do it. Same thing with your examiners. Have them reach out to me. If there's something I've talked about, you want more information, please feel free to get a hold of me. The last 13 years of my law enforcement career was working for the prosecutor's office in Maricopa County. I had a lot of fun working with the prosecutors. We developed a very good working relationship on all types of cases. Look over the questions here if we had any. Amy, do you have anything more you want to ask or throw in here?
No, if we can give people like another minute or so, and then if no one has any questions, we can just wrap it up.
All right. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions coming in. And so if you all do have any additional questions, like Dean, our presenter, had mentioned, you can go ahead and email him at the email address that he's provided here. So I'll go ahead and finish this on out here and just complete with a few reminders. And first and foremost, I definitely want to thank Dean for presenting his content. Also, thanks for our moderator, Amy, for a great discussion on a great topic. We just have a few brief reminders. You may contact INTAC through the website displayed on this slide. You can stay up to date on the latest information by signing up for INTAC's TTA listserv. Also, don't forget to check us out on Facebook at OJJDP TTA. You may also contact OJJDP via the help desk by following the contact information on this slide. Do you have a training or technical assistance need? Well, if so, please visit OJJDP's TTA 360 platform to submit a request for help. Please take a few minutes to review the disclaimer here. And please join us for our next webinar in our series, Delayed Discourse of Sexual Abuse, Building the Case. This webinar will be held on November 20th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. The registration link is live, so feel free to click on the link and register now. Also join us for these upcoming INTAC-hosted webinars. Again, these registration links are also live, so feel free to click and register now. As a reminder, please take a few minutes to click the link and complete the online evaluation. Again, thank you all for today's webinar, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.